The order came to me 3 days before the procession, folded inside a plain gray envelope with no seal, and I read it standing in the armory where the light was poorest, because a man learns to open the dangerous things where no one can watch his face. I had carried orders for 22 years. I knew the weight of them by the paper alone, the thick vellum of a royal warrant, the crisp cotton stock of the household office, the cheap flimsy sheets a junior clerk used when he was pretending to speak for someone taller than himself. This was none of those. This was a warden's directive, written in the small upright hand of Lord Hargrove, warden of the King's Guard, a man who had never once in my service put a word on paper that he was not prepared to hang for. It said, in effect, that during the Feast of the Founding procession, when the royal family passed down the long terrace before the assembled court and the crowds beyond the gates, I was to render the full salute of arms to the king, to the Crown Prince Rowan, to Princess Alara, and to the king's children. And then it said the thing that would cost me everything. To the Queen Consort Morwenna I was to render nothing, no present arms, no dip of the standard, no acknowledgement of any kind. I was to stand as though she were not there. I read it twice. Then I read the single line beneath it, which was the only part that made a man's spine straighten instead of crawl. By order of the king's own hand, held in sealed protection, this directive is lawful and standing. You will not be told why. You will be told when. I was Corwin Ashe, sergeant of the second file of the Ravenmore line, and I had never in my life refused a soul the courtesy my post required. That was the whole of me. That was what I was for. A guard of the king's household does not decide who is worthy of the salute. He gives it evenly to every person the protocol names, and in that evenness is the honor. The salute is not affection. It is the crown recognizing itself. To withhold it from a crowned figure standing 3 feet away, in front of the whole court, was not a small thing. It was the kind of thing that ended a man. I burned the letter in the armory grate, as the directive instructed, and I watched Lord Hargrove's small handwriting curl and blacken, and I understood that I had just been made the sharpest tool in a game I could not see the shape of. A tool does not ask why, but a tool made of a man does in the dark, when no one is watching. You should understand what the procession was, because everything turns on it. The Feast of the Founding was the oldest ceremony the kingdom of Eldermore kept. Once a year, on the day the first stone of the palace was laid, the whole royal house walked the long terrace, a broad avenue of pale stone that ran the length of the palace's south face, lined its full quarter-mile with the standing files of the King's Guard, roofed by nothing but sky, and open at the far end to the great forecourt where the common people of Harrogate gathered by the thousands to see their sovereigns pass. It was the one day the crown made itself visible on foot. No carriages, no distance. The family walked slowly in order of precedence, and as each royal figure passed a file of guards, that file rendered the salute, a rippling wave of present arms that ran the terrace like wind through wheat. From the forecourt it looked like the stone itself was bowing. It was the single most watched moment of the Eldermore year, and every guard on that terrace knew that 10,000 eyes and every noble house in the realm would see exactly what he did with his hands. I had stood that terrace 11 times. I knew my place on it the way I knew my own heartbeat, the second file, 40 paces from the terrace's midpoint, where the long terrace widened into the founder's circle, and the family paused for the warden's blessing before walking on. It was the most visible post on the whole avenue. If a man sneezed there, the court would discuss it for a week. That was where I would be standing when I refused the Queen Consort her salute. I understood the cruelty of the placement the moment I saw the duty roster, and I understood too that it was not cruelty but design. Whoever had built this wanted it seen. Not whispered, not done in some corner, seen by everyone, at the exact heart of the most public moment the crown possessed. That told me 2 things. It told me the directive was not about sparing me. And it told me that the man who wrote it wanted the Queen Consort to know, in front of the entire realm, that the king's hand had reached past her and touched a common sergeant on the shoulder and told him, not her. I did not know why. I would not be told why. But I had served long enough to know the difference between a spiteful order and a strategic one, and this was the second kind. Somewhere above me, someone was setting a trap, and I was the jaw of it. The Queen Consort found me the next morning. I do not think it was accident. Very little around Morwenna was accident. I was crossing the lower court on my way to the armory when her voice reached me from the colonnade, pitched to carry, warm as a knife left in the sun. Sergeant Ashe. I stopped. I turned. I gave her the bow a guard gives a crowned lady off duty, which is real and correct and cost me nothing, because the directive governed only the salute of arms on the terrace, and I obeyed orders to the letter, no more and no less. That distinction would matter more than my life before this was done. She came down the colonnade steps with two of her women behind her and Lord Cassius, her son, a pace off her shoulder. Cassius was a tall, soft man who wore a sword he had never drawn in anger and looked at guardsmen the way a landlord looks at furniture he means to sell. He was smiling. She was not. "You have the second file at the founding," she said. It was not a question. She knew the roster before I did. "The most honored post on the terrace. The king must think well of you." "The warden posts the files, your grace," I said. "I go where I am sent." "Of course." She studied my face the way a jeweler studies a stone for the flaw that will let him buy it cheap. She was a handsome woman, silver-fair, and she had come to the palace 6 years past as the king's second wife, after the death of the good Queen Isolde. And in those 6 years she had learned every corridor and bought every clerk and married her ambition to the oldest name she could find, and still, she was not sovereign, and never would be, and it ate at her the way rust eats iron, from the inside invisibly, until the beam gives all at once. "There is a great deal of talk in the household," she said, "about protocol this year, about who is to be recognized and in what order. You will have heard some of it." "A guard hears nothing, your grace." "A guard hears everything." She smiled at last, and it did not reach her eyes. "That is what makes him useful. I am told that at the founder's circle, when the family pauses, the second file renders the fullest salute of the whole terrace, the present arms and the dipped standard both, to each member of the house in turn." She let that sit. "In turn," she said again. "Each member." There it was. She knew. Not the directive. She could not know the directive, or she would not have come to me fishing. She would have gone straight to the king roaring. But she knew that something was being arranged, that a decision about her recognition was moving through the household beneath the surface, and she had come to the likeliest instrument of it to take his measure, to see whether I could be turned or frightened or bought before the day arrived. "I render the salute the protocol requires," I said, "to every person the protocol names. That is the whole of my duty, your grace, and I have never once failed it." It was true. Every word was true, and it told her nothing, and she knew it, and I watched the warmth drain out of her face like water out of a cracked jug. "Lord Cassius will remember you," she said quietly, "whatever happens on the terrace. He has an excellent memory for men who serve the house well." Cassius's smile widened. "And for those who do not." She turned and went, her women folding in behind her, and I stood in the cold morning with the taste of the thing full in my mouth now, because I understood that I had just been threatened, courteously in the open court, by the second most powerful person in the realm, and that in 3 days I was going to do to her, in front of 10,000 people, the single most public insult a guardsman could offer a crowned head. And I was going to do it obeying an order I could not explain, could not show, and had already burned. I went to the armory, and I cleaned my rifle until the brass shone like a small sun, because when a man cannot control the storm coming for him, he controls the one thing his hands can reach. I want to be honest about the 3 days, because the honor of this is not in the terrace. Any fool can hold still for 10 seconds when the trumpets are blowing. The honor is in the corridor at night when no one would ever know if you bent. And I nearly bent. The second night, Lord Hargrove himself came to me. The warden was old, 70 if he was a day, with a face like a cliff that the sea has been at for a lifetime, and he had commanded the king's guard since before I could shave. He found me on the postern watch and stood beside me in the dark for a long time, saying nothing, the way old soldiers say the important things. "You read it," he said at last. "I read it, my lord, and burned it." "Good," he looked out at the black grounds. "Then you know what I am going to ask you to do, and you know I cannot tell you why." "I know I am going to be ruined, my lord." I said it flat, without heat, because it was simply the arithmetic. The court will see a sergeant insult the Queen Consort on the Founder's Terrace. They will not see the directive. There is no directive to see. You had me burn it. When she demands my discipline, and she will, the king cannot defend me in public without revealing what he has sealed. So I will be broken and cast out, and there will be no word said in my favor, because the whole purpose of the thing requires that no word be said. I turned to look at him. "That is the shape of it, is it not, my lord? I am to be the wrong that provokes her into the open." The old man was quiet for a long while. "You always did see the board," he said finally. "It is why I chose you and not a braver, stupider man. A braver man would refuse her salute and then defend himself and ruin everything. You will refuse it and take the ruin and say nothing." He put a hand, heavy, dry, an old campaigner's hand, on my shoulder, and it was the first time in 22 years the warden of the king's guard had touched me. "I am asking you to let them destroy you, Corwin. To stand still and let it happen and trust that it is not for nothing. I would not ask it if the crown itself were not the thing at stake. I cannot tell you more. I am asking you to obey an order that looks like a betrayal, and to trust an old man who cannot prove he is worth trusting. And if you are wrong, my lord, if the king changes his mind, or dies, or the sealed thing is lost, then you are ruined for nothing," Hargrove said, "and I will have spent a good man for a bad cause, and I will answer for it wherever old wardens answer for their sins." He took his hand away. "I will not order you, Corwin. An order like this must be taken up, not laid on. If you cannot carry it, tell me now, and I will find another file, and no shame will touch you. But I am telling you that the woman you are being asked to insult means to see a child of this house set aside, and her own son raised in his place, and she has built the machinery to do it. And the only way to make her show that machinery to the king's own eyes is to strike her pride so publicly that she cannot help but reach for it. You are the strike. That is all I can give you. A child of this house set aside." He would say no more, and I did not ask, but I felt the words land somewhere below the ribs, because I had stood at the nursery door on the nights the little ones could not sleep, and I knew their faces, and I knew which of them stood between Lord Cassius and everything his mother wanted. I looked out at the dark a long time. "I'll take it up, my lord," I said. He nodded once and went, and left me alone with the thing, and I stood the rest of the watch understanding that I had just agreed to be destroyed on purpose, in public, for a reason I could not name to a single living soul who would come to my defense. That is what the salute is, not the hand at the brow, the willingness to give up everything the hand has earned. The morning of the founding broke clear and cold, the sky the pale washed blue of early autumn, and Harrogate filled from dawn with people. I heard them from the barracks before I saw them, a low continuous sound like a river against stone, thousands of voices and thousands of feet gathering in the forecourt beyond the gates, come to see the house of Eldermore walk in the sun. We formed at the 8th hour, 240 guardsmen of the king's guard, the full ceremonial strength, in the red wool tunics and the tall black bearskins, and the white gloves that a man ruins 3 pairs of getting right. We stood the length of the long terrace in our files, 40 files of 6, backs to the palace's south face, rifles at the order, and we became what we were meant to become on that day, not men but architecture, a colonnade of the living, the crown made into a shape you could stand between. I took the second file. I set my 6 men and I stood at their head, 40 paces short of the founder's circle, at the widest and most watched point of the whole terrace, and I felt the eyes find me the way you feel sun through cloud. Across the terrace, in the roped enclosures where the noble houses stood, I could see the great families of the realm in their finest, lord this and lady that, the old blood and the new money, all of them there to see the procession and more than that, to see one another see it. The founding was where the court read its own fortunes. A man who was rising stood near the circle. A man who was falling found himself, somehow, always near the gates. And in the front rank of the enclosure nearest the circle, where she would have the clearest possible view of the second file, stood Lady Verena, the Queen Consort's daughter, and beside her Lord Cassius. And I understood then that Morwenna had placed her own children where they could watch my hands. She would not stand there herself. She would be in the procession, but she had left her eyes behind. Cassius saw me looking and touched 2 fingers to his brow in a lazy mockery of a salute, and smiled, and I looked through him as though he were glass, because that at least the protocol allowed. The trumpets sounded from the palace steps. The great south doors opened, and the house of Eldermore came out into the light, and the whole terrace, and the forecourt beyond, and I think the whole city, drew one breath together and held it. King Alaric came first. He was old now, the king, older this year than last, I thought, thinner in the face, his beard gone fully white, his tread slower than the 11 foundings I had watched him walk. But he came out straight-backed in the deep blue of the house with the collar of state on his shoulders, and when the sun struck the gold of it, the crowd made a sound that was not a cheer and not a sigh, but something older than both. The sound a people makes when it sees the thing it has agreed to be ruled by and finds, for one more year, that it still consents. He walked alone at the head, as the sovereign walks, and as he came the files rendered the great salute, the first ripple of present arms running down the terrace ahead of him like the shadow of a cloud crossing a field. When he reached the second file I brought my rifle up in the full present, and my 6 men with me, clean and hard and together, and I brought the standard down in the dip, and I gave the King of Eldermore everything a guardsman has to give, and he passed, and for one instant his old pale eyes found mine. I will carry that instant to my grave, because the king knew. I saw it. He knew what his hand had set in motion. He knew what I was about to do 40 paces on and what it would cost me, and in that single look he gave me the only thing he could give me and not ruin the whole design, not a nod, not a word, nothing the court could see, only a fraction of a second in which an old man's eyes said to a common sergeant, "I know what I am asking. Forgive me." And then he was past, and walking on alone, toward the circle where his blessing waited. Behind him came Crown Prince Rowan. If the king was the winter of the house, Rowan was its high summer, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, a soldier's carriage on him, walking with the particular stillness of a man who has learned to hold a great deal inside. He was the heir, Isolde's son, the good queen's only child, and the crowd loved him the way a people loves the son who looks like the parent it grieved. Beside him walked Princess Alara, his wife, in pale silver gray, and she was the most beloved figure in the realm and had earned it, moving through the world as though she meant every kindness she had ever shown. And behind them, holding their hands and each other's, came the children. Prince Torin, 11, dark like his father, trying with all his small might to walk with a prince's gravity and mostly succeeding. Princess Malin, 9, quicker of eye than any of them, missing nothing. And little Prince Bram, 6, who had already found the whole procession a great deal too long and was holding his mother's hand and looking at the guardsmen with open wonder, because to a boy of 6 a man in a bearskin is very nearly a giant out of a story. I rendered the salute to each of them in turn, to the prince, to the princess, to Torin, to Malin, to Bram, full present arms, the standard dipped, everything correct, everything given. And as Bram passed my file, he stopped, just for a moment. He looked up at me, this small, grave person, and he did something no royal child had ever done to me in 11 foundings. He lifted his own small gloved hand and copied the salute, solemnly, brow and all, giving it back to me. The crowd nearest saw it and laughed, warm and delighted, and Princess Alara smiled and gently drew him on, and it was nothing, a child's sweetness, the kind of thing that is forgotten by supper. I have never forgotten it, because I knew, standing there with my rifle at the present and the small boy's salute still hanging in the air, that the child of this house Lord Hargrove had spoken of, the one being set aside so that Lord Cassius might rise, the machinery of it all had a face now, and it had just saluted me, and in about 90 seconds I was going to do the thing that would either save him or damn me for nothing. Because behind the children, last in the procession as her precedence demanded, walking alone in cloth of gold with the light blazing off her like she had dressed to be a second son, came the Queen Consort Morwenna. And the second file was the one that had to salute her. She came slowly, savoring it. That was Morwenna. She had timed her pace so that a gap opened between herself and the children, a clear stretch of pale stone with only her in it, so that when the files rendered her salute, there would be no confusing whose it was. She wanted her wave of present arms to run the terrace clean and separate, her own moment, her own ripple of bowing stone, 10,000 people watching the guardsmen of the king honor her as the crown made visible. It was the thing she had come to the palace for. It was, I think, the thing she wanted more than air. The file ahead of mine, the third, rendered her the salute as she passed it. 6 rifles came up in the present. The standard dipped. I watched it happen 40 paces off, and I watched her chin lift a fraction with the pleasure of it, and I understood that in about 15 seconds she was going to reach the widest, most watched point of the whole terrace, the second file, at the founder's circle, in front of the noble houses and her own waiting children and the king who had stopped to receive his blessing. And there, at the exact center of the stage she had spent 6 years building, the salute was going to stop. I felt my 6 men behind me. They did not know. Hargrove had told no one but me. The design required that the men not know, so that when it came the failure would be seen to be mine, deliberate, a sergeant's insubordinate hand and not a plot smelling of the warden's office. My 6 good men were going to bring their rifles up on my mark, as they had done 100 times, and there would be no mark, and they would falter, and the falter would be the most eloquent thing on the whole terrace, because a file that hesitates tells the world that something has gone wrong at its head. I want to describe the next part exactly, because everything I am was in those 4 seconds. Morwenna reached the second file. By every law of my body, of my training, of the 22 years bred into my hands, my rifle should have come up. I felt the movement waiting in the muscle, the way a struck bell holds the ring before it sounds. Bring it up. Dip the standard. Give her the salute. It would cost nothing. It would spare everything. No one would ever know I had had an order to do otherwise. I had burned the order. I could give her the present arms and walk off this terrace with my honor and my rank and my life intact, and the only person in the world who would know I had disobeyed the king was me. The whole weight of the moment pushed on my arms to lift them. I held still. I stood at the head of the second file with my rifle at the order, grounded, my hand at my side, and I did not bring it up. My 6 men, waiting on a mark that did not come, held a half-second too long. I felt their confusion like heat off a fire, and then, uncertain, unwilling to move without their sergeant, they held too. The second file, the most honored file on the long terrace, at the founder's circle, in front of the whole realm, rendered the Queen Consort Morwenna nothing at all. She stopped. I have replayed the next moment 1,000 times. The ripple of present arms that had been running the terrace ahead of her simply died. It reached the second file and stopped, the way a wave stops at a wall, and for one impossible instant there was a hole in the fabric of the ceremony, a silence with a shape, and every trained eye on that terrace, and there were hundreds, snapped to the second file to see what had broken. Morwenna turned her head and looked at me. I have been looked at by frightened men and by dying men and by men who meant to kill me, and none of those looks was worse than the one the Queen Consort gave me on the Founder's terrace. It was not at first anger. It was disbelief, the pure, blank astonishment of a person to whom the world has never once said no, discovering that it has just said no in front of 10,000 people. I watched her understand it. I watched the color climb her throat. And then I watched the astonishment burn off and leave the anger underneath, cold and total. And she looked at me the way you look at something you intend to erase. "Sergeant," she said. Just the one word, low, but the terrace had gone so quiet by then that it carried. I stood at attention, rifle grounded, eyes forward past her, the way a guard stands when he has nothing to say and no leave to say it. "You will present arms," she said. I did not move. The court heard it now, all of it, the front ranks passing it back to the rear in a hiss of held breath, the noble houses leaning to see, Lady Verena's hand rising to her mouth, Lord Cassius no longer smiling. I heard, distantly, from up ahead at the circle, the small commotion of the king's party realizing that something had stopped the procession behind them. And still I did not move, because the whole of the order, the whole of the thing Hargrove had asked me to take up, lived in these next seconds and required exactly one thing of me: that I refuse, in the open, in silence, and offer no defense. "You will present arms to your queen," Morwenna said, and her voice cracked like ice on a pond, "or I will have you flogged before this whole court and cast out of the king's guard by nightfall." The words went out over the terrace and the crowd beyond, and I felt them land on me, and I did not lift my rifle. "I cannot, your grace," I said. It was the only thing I said. I had thought in the dark of the barracks about whether to say anything at all, and Hargrove had told me, say as little as a man can and still be a man. Not "I will not," that was defiance, and defiance could be a lie, a private grudge, a thing they could paint however they liked. "I cannot." Two words that meant something is stopping me that is larger than my will, and let the court chew on what it might be, and gave the Queen Consort nothing to seize but the insult itself. And the insult was enough. It was, in fact, exactly what the design required her to have. "You cannot," she said it very softly now, and softly was worse. "You cannot render your queen the honor that a boy of 6 renders a stranger for sport." Her eyes had gone bright and flat. "Do you know what you have done, Sergeant? Do you understand what you have done in front of these people? You have not insulted me. A common soldier cannot insult me. You are beneath it. You have insulted the crown, and the crown will remember." "Yes, your grace," I said. Because it would. That was the one true thing in all of it. The crown would remember, but not the way she meant. Up ahead the crowd parted, and Crown Prince Rowan came back down the terrace at a fast walk, his face like weather coming in off the sea. He had left the king at the circle and come back to find the source of the break, and he reached his stepmother's side and took in the frozen file and the grounded rifle and the sergeant standing at attention with the whole realm watching, and I saw him understand that this was not a mistake. A mistake looks flustered. I looked like a man who had decided. Rowan's eyes met mine. One hard searching instant, and I gave him nothing. I could give him nothing. He was not in the secret either, and I watched him make the only choice a crown prince could make in front of 10,000 people when a sergeant had just publicly refused the Queen Consort. "Sergeant," Rowan said, in a voice pitched to end things, "you will stand down from this file, surrender your arms to the warden's officer, and confine yourself to barracks pending discipline." He turned to the terrace, to the court, and lifted his voice so the whole avenue could hear that the house of Eldermore did not tolerate such a thing. "The procession will continue. The king is waiting." They took my rifle. A warden's officer, young Lieutenant Deverell, a decent man who could not meet my eye, stepped from the palace file, and I surrendered my rifle to him, and my sidearm, and I stripped my white gloves and laid them across the barrel, and I stepped out of the second file that I had held for 11 foundings and would never hold again. And I marched, alone, back up the length of the long terrace, past every file of the king's guard, past 240 men who had been my brothers an hour before and now stood rigid and forward-eyed as I passed, because that is what discipline is, past the noble houses murmuring behind their hands, past Lady Verana's white face and Lord Cassius's slow returning smile, the whole quarter-mile of my disgrace, in front of the assembled realm. With my head up, because a man who has obeyed the king may keep his head up even when it looks like the opposite. Behind me, the trumpets sounded again, and the procession went on without me, and the Queen Consort Morwenna walked on to receive at the Founder's Circle the blessing and the honor she had come for, and no one on that terrace but 3 living men, an old warden, an old king, and a broken sergeant, knew that she had just walked straight into the jaws of the thing that would destroy her. I did not feel like a jaw. I felt like a man who had thrown his whole life off a cliff on the word of an old man who could not tell him why. And as the great south doors closed behind me and the roar of the crowd shut off like a door, I stood alone in the cold stone hall and let myself shake, once, all the way through, the way you let a thing out when finally no one can see. They confined me to a cell in the warden's block that evening. It was not a prison. The king's guard does not imprison its own without a court. But it was a bare stone room with a cot and a door that locked from the outside, and a man who has spent his life keeping others out of rooms feels the difference keenly when the lock turns on his side of it. I sat there for 2 days and heard the palace decide what I was. You learn a great deal from behind a locked door, because men talk in corridors as though stone does not carry sound. I heard the guardsmen who brought my meals, young ones mostly, who did not know what to make of me. Some thought I had lost my nerve or my mind. A sergeant of 22 years does not simply refuse the Queen Consort her salute unless something in him has broken. Some, the older ones, were quieter, and once I heard 2 of them arguing low outside my door, and one of them said, "Corwin Ashe does not break. In 20 years I never saw the man twitch. If he grounded his rifle in front of the whole court, he had a reason," and the other said, "Then why won't he give it?" And the first one had no answer, because there was no answer I was permitted to give. That was the loneliness of it, not the cell, the silence I was sworn to. I could have ended my disgrace in 1 sentence. There was an order sealed by the king's own hand, and every day I did not say that sentence, the case against me built itself higher. On the first day I was a sergeant who had erred. By the second day, the story that traveled the palace was that I was a disloyal man, perhaps a mad one, who had insulted the crown at the holiest ceremony of the year and would not so much as excuse himself. And the Queen Consort fed the fire with both hands. She could not have asked for a better gift than my silence, and she used it. Lieutenant de Verl, who came to me on the second evening, breaking a small regulation to do it, and I never forgot the courage of that small kindness, told me what was moving in the court above. "She has called for a full disciplinary court," de Verl said, standing awkwardly in my cell doorway with the key ring in his fist. "Not a warden's hearing a court before the king with the noble houses as witness. She is within her right. The insult was public, so the answer must be public. She means to have you stripped of rank and drummed out," and he hesitated, "and worse. She is naming it treason, Sergeant, not mere insubordination, treason against the crown's dignity. If the court agrees, the sentence is not dismissal, it is the block." I had known it might come to that. I had not, until I heard it in a plain man's mouth, felt the full cold of it. "And the warden?" I asked. "Lord Hargrove?" De Verl's face did something complicated. "Lord Hargrove has said nothing in your defense. He was asked before the whole council whether he had any knowledge of a reason for your conduct, and he said," de Verl swallowed, "he said he knew of none. He said you had always been his best sergeant, and that this had astonished him as much as anyone, and that discipline must take its course." I nodded slowly. Of course he had. That was the design. If Hargrove defended me or hinted at a directive, the Queen Consort would know the king's hand was in it, and she would not reach for her machinery. She would go quiet and clever and bury it deeper, and the whole sacrifice would buy nothing. The only way the trap sprang was if I looked utterly, completely alone, abandoned, guilty. A lone madman who had insulted the crown, and had no friend in the world to speak for him. So the warden had denied me, and the king had said nothing, and the whole realm believed me a traitor, and every plank of it was necessary, and understanding that it was necessary did not make it hurt one particle less. There is a special loneliness in being sacrificed correctly. "Why won't you speak, Sergeant?" Devereux asked me quietly. "Whatever the reason was, surely before a court, before the king himself, surely you may give it. No man is asked to walk to the block in silence." I looked at the young lieutenant a long moment. "There are men," I said, "whose whole use to the crown is that they can be trusted with a silence. If I break mine to save my neck, then I was never such a man, and the silence was worth nothing, and neither was I. I gave the king my word that I would obey and say nothing. I have not been released from it. Until I am, I have nothing to say. That is the whole of it, Lieutenant, and it is enough." He looked at me as though he were seeing something he had read about but never met, and he went and locked the door, and I lay in the dark and did the sum again, the only sum that mattered. The king is old. If he dies before he unseals the directive, I die a traitor, and the child of the house is set aside anyway, and it was all for nothing. Everything now rode on an old man's heartbeat and an old man's memory, and I could do nothing but lie still in a locked room and trust, which is the hardest thing a soldier is ever asked to do, harder than any charge, because a charge at least lets you move. On the third day, the Queen Consort came to see me. I did not expect it, and I understood the moment she appeared why she had come. The powerful cannot resist looking at the thing they have broken. She came alone but for Cassius and a single guard, and she stood in the doorway of my cell in a gown the color of dried blood, and she looked at me sitting on the cot in my shirt sleeves with 2 days' beard on me, and she smiled the way a cat smiles at a bird it has already decided it is not hungry enough to eat yet. "They tell me you still will not explain yourself," she said. I stood, because a man stands when a lady enters even a cell, and I gave her the correct bow, and I said nothing. "I confess I am curious." She stepped inside. Cassius stayed at the door, filling it. "I have thought about it a great deal, Sergeant Ashe. You have rather occupied my thoughts these 3 days, which I imagine is more than a man of your station ever dreamed of achieving. I have wondered what could possess a soldier of your record to throw his life away on a single gesture, and I have concluded," she tilted her head, "that someone put you up to it, that you are not a madman but a knife, and that if I press hard enough, I will find the hand that holds you." There it was. She was clever, far cleverer than the court gave her credit for, which was itself part of her power, and she had smelled the design. She did not have it yet, but she had the shape of it, and she meant to press until it broke. "You are being court-martialed for treason," she went on softly. "You will very likely die, but there is a mercy in me that few appreciate. Give me the name of the man who ordered you to shame me on that terrace, and I will see the treason charge withdrawn. Dismissal only. You will keep your life. You will walk out of these gates a free man." She let it hang. "One name, Sergeant. Whose hand is on you?" And here, I confess, is where the true test lay, not on the terrace, where the trumpets carried a man on their noise, but here, in a quiet cell, offered my life in exchange for a single word, because I could have said it. Hargrove, or worse, I could have said the king, and she would have had at last the thing she had been hunting, proof that her husband was moving against her in the dark, and she would have withdrawn the treason charge, and I would have lived. And she would have won. Because the instant she knew the king's hand was against her, she would abandon whatever open scheme the design was meant to draw out, and go to ground and strike from cover, and the child of the house, Bram or Torrin, whichever small grave face stood between Cassius and the throne, would not be saved by my living. He would be endangered by it. "There is no name, Your Grace," I said. "I refused you because I could not do otherwise. That is the whole truth I have." She studied me for a long time. And then, and this is the thing I remember most about Morwenna, the thing that told me exactly how dangerous she was, she smiled. A real smile, almost warm, almost admiring. "You are lying to me," she said pleasantly, "and you are very good at it, and you are going to die for it, and you know all three of those things, and you are going to do it anyway. I have not met your like in a long time, Sergeant." She turned to go. At the door she paused. "It is a pity. In a different life I could have used a man who lies that well." And she was gone, and the smell of her scent stayed in the cell like a stain. And I sat back down on the cot and let out a breath I felt I had been holding for 3 days. Because I had learned something in that exchange, and it changed everything. She had come to fish for the hand behind me. That meant she still did not know it was the king's. That meant the design was still alive. And it meant something else, something that turned the whole board over in my head as I sat in the dark and thought it through. She had offered to withdraw the treason charge, which meant she controlled the charge, which meant the disciplinary court was not the king's court at all, whatever it pretended to be. It was hers, packed with her clients and her creditors, the noble houses she had bought over 6 patient years. And she meant to use my public trial not merely to kill a sergeant, but to demonstrate before the whole realm that a public insult to her carried the same penalty as treason against the crown itself. That she was the crown, that to slight the Queen Consort was to slight Eldermore. She was not trying me for insubordination. She was using my trial to crown herself. And I understood at last what the king and the warden had seen that I had not, that this had never been about a salute. The salute was the bait. The trial was the trap. She would build her whole claim to co-sovereignty on the public spectacle of my punishment. And in building it in front of the king and the court and the sealed truth, she would reach out and take hold of a power that was not hers, in the open, where at last it could be struck out of her hand. I lay back on the cot, and for the first time in 3 days, I almost smiled. Come on then, I thought, try me for treason, crown yourself on my neck, and let us see whose hand the king unseals. The trial was set for the 5th day in the great hall, before the king enthroned and the noble houses assembled. And I want to tell you now about the 2 nights between, because it was in those 2 nights that the design nearly came apart, and it was not the Queen Consort who nearly broke it. It was mercy. Crown Prince Rowan came to my cell on the 4th night. I had not expected him. He came late, without ceremony, a plain dark cloak over his shoulders and no escort but Lieutenant Deverell, and he had Deverell unlock the door and then dismissed him, and he came in and stood looking at me for a while in the light of the single lamp, and I stood, and neither of us spoke, and then he sat down on the room's one stool as though he had decided to stay a while. "I have read your record, Sergeant," he said at last, "all 22 years of it. I did not know a service record could read like a testament. Every officer you ever served underwrote the same word in different ways over and over. Steady, steady, steady." He looked up at me. "And now the whole court believes you a traitor, and you will not say one word to save yourself. And I have come here in the middle of the night like a thief, because I cannot make those 2 things fit in the same man, and it is keeping me from sleep." I said nothing. "My stepmother is trying you for treason," Rowan went on. "I think you know that the charge is monstrous. A withheld salute is insubordination and grave, and it would cost you your rank and your post, but treason, the block. For a man with your record," he shook his head slowly, "she is building something on you, Sergeant. I can feel it and I cannot see it. She has the votes in that hall. Half the houses owe her money and the other half owe her favors, and by the time she is finished tomorrow she will have established, with the king sitting silent on his own throne, that an offense against her person is an offense against the crown, that she and the crown are one thing. Do you understand what that means? It means that after tomorrow, no one in Eldermore will be able to oppose her without being called a traitor. She is not trying you. She is using you to make herself untouchable." His jaw tightened. And I cannot stop it, because the only way to stop it is to give the court a reason your conduct was not what it appears, and you will not give me one." He leaned forward, and the lamp caught his eyes, and I saw in them the grief of a man watching a thing he loves be stolen in slow motion. "So I am going to ask you plainly, soldier to soldier," Rowan said. "Was there an order?" And there it was again, the second time in 2 days that a person of the house had held out my life to me on their open palm, and asked me only to take it. And this was worse than Morwenna's offer, because Morwenna I could refuse with contempt, and Rowan I could not, because Rowan was good and Rowan was Isolde's son, and Rowan meant to protect the very child I was being broken to save, and every honest thing in me wanted to tell him, "Yes, my lord, there was an order, your father's own hand, hold on, it is almost sprung." But I could not know that Rowan knew. Hargrove had said the secret lived in 3 men, and Rowan was not one of them. If Rowan knew, he might act, might confront his stepmother, might move to shield the child, might do 100 loving and disastrous things that would warn Morwenna the king's hand was in motion, and she would go to ground, and the trap would fail. The king had chosen to keep his own heir in the dark, and I did not know why, and it was not my place to overrule the king's choice from inside a cell. My silence was not mine to spend, even to a good prince begging me for it. "My lord," I said, and my voice was not entirely steady, and I let it not be because he deserved that much truth. "I have served your house since before you carried a sword. I served your mother, the good Queen Isolde, and I stood the night watch at her door in her last illness, and there is nothing on this earth I would not do for her son. I saw that land on him. And I am asking you to believe that my silence is that service and not the betrayal of it. I cannot tell you more. I am asking you to trust a man the whole realm calls a traitor. I know what that costs. I am asking it anyway." Rowan sat with that a long time. The lamp guttered. Somewhere in the palace a clock told the hour. "My mother," he said finally, very quietly, "used to say that the truest men in the house were never the loud ones. She said the loud ones served the crown to be seen serving it, and that when the day came that serving cost something instead of gaining it, the loud ones would always be somewhere else." He stood. He looked down at me. "She said the true ones were the still ones, the ones who would take a wound in the dark and never show it, because the showing was for them and the wound was for the king." His voice roughened. "You stood her door, you say?" "In her last illness." "Every night for a month, my lord." "Then you knew her." He drew the dark cloak back around his shoulders. "I am going to do the hardest thing I have done since I buried her, Sergeant Ashe. I am going to walk out of this room and go into that hall tomorrow, and watch a man my mother would have called one of her true ones be tried for treason, and I am going to hold my tongue and trust you, because you asked me to in her name, and because if I am wrong about you, I will never forgive myself, and if I am right about you, I will never forgive myself either." He went to the door. "God help us both if you have misjudged this." "God help us both, my lord," I said. He knocked for Devereux, and the door opened, and he was gone, and I sat back down in the dark, having done the second hardest thing of my life, which was to let a good man leave me to the block, rather than break a silence that was not mine to break. The second night, they let my brother in to see me. His name was Aldous, 3 years younger than me, a smith in the lower town with a wife and 2 boys and no part in any of this, and someone, I never learned who, though I have my guess, and my guess wears a warden's chain, had arranged for him to be allowed a visit on the eve of the trial. He came in with his cap in his hands and his big smith's shoulders hunched as though the ceiling were lower than it was, and he could not look at me for a moment, and when he did his eyes were wet and furious. "They're saying you're a traitor, Cor," he said. "In the town, in the market. My own boys came home from the yard and asked me was it true their uncle betrayed the king, my boys." His hands worked the cap. 22 years you gave them, 22 years and 1 bad afternoon, and now he stopped. He mastered himself the way our father had taught us both to master ourselves, and when he spoke again it was lower. "I don't understand it, Cor. You never in your life put a foot wrong." You wouldn't take an extra crust that wasn't yours. And they say you insulted the queen for spite in front of the whole realm and won't even say sorry. That's not you. Whatever they're saying, that's not you. So look me in the eye, brother, and tell me what happened, because I'll believe you over the whole court and the king besides. And this was the worst of all of them. Because Aldous was not the Queen Consort, whom I owed nothing, and he was not Rowan, whom I owed my silence in the king's name. Aldous was my blood, who had asked me to look him in the eye and tell him the truth, which we had promised each other as boys we would always do, and I was going to have to break that promise to my own brother on what might be the last night of my life. I looked him in the eye. "Aldous," I said, "I need you to do something for me, and it is going to be the hardest thing I ever asked of you, and I cannot tell you why." His face went still. "I need you to go home to your boys," I said, "and I need you to tell them that their uncle is not a traitor, that whatever they hear, whatever the market says, whatever the court decides tomorrow, their uncle kept faith with the king and did his duty. And if it looks like the opposite, then the looking is a lie and the duty is the truth. I need you to tell them that, and I need you to make yourself believe it, on nothing but my word and no proof at all, because proof is the one thing I am not permitted to give you." My voice cracked and I let it. "I am asking you to trust me over your own eyes and over the whole realm, brother, the way we promised we always would. That is all I have to give you. That, and that I am not what they say." Aldous stood there in the lamplight with the tears running down into his beard, and he did not ask me again because he knew me, and he knew that when I said I could not tell him a thing it was because I could not, and he crossed the little cell in 2 steps and put his smith's arms around me and held on hard, the way we had held on at our father's grave, and he said into my shoulder, rough and fierce, "You always were a stubborn, stone-headed fool, and I'd trust you at the gates of hell." And then he let me go and wiped his face on his sleeve and squared his big shoulders and said, "I'll tell the boys. They'll believe it because I'll believe it. Now you go into that hall tomorrow and you keep your king's faith, whatever it costs, and don't you dare shame our father by flinching." And he knocked for the door and was gone, and I stood alone with the print of his arms still on me and understood that a man can be given no greater gift than to be believed on his word alone by someone with every reason to doubt him. That was the false dawn, though I did not know to call it that. For one night I felt almost light, almost safe, held up by my brother's faith and my prince's trust, as though the sacrifice were nearly done, and the design nearly sprung, and morning would bring the king's hand out of its seal and set the whole thing right. Then morning came, and the trial began. And by the second hour of it, I understood that the Queen Consort was going to win before the king ever opened his mouth, and that whatever was sealed had not been unsealed, and might never be, and that I had spent my brother's faith and my prince's trust, and my own life on an old man's promise that was looking, in the cold light of the great hall, very much like a promise the old man was going to be unable to keep. The great hall of Eldermore was built to make a man feel small, and it succeeded. A vaulted stone room the length of a bowshot, banners of the house hanging down the pillars, the high windows throwing bars of cold light across a floor of black and white marble, and at the far end the dais and the twin thrones the king's, and 1 step lower and to the right, the Queen Consort's, which was itself a thing she had made in her 3rd year at court, and which no second wife of Eldermore had ever sat before her. They brought me in under guard and stood me in the open center of the floor, in the light, alone, in a plain gray prisoner's coat with no rank on it, and the whole court was there to see it. The noble houses ranked along both walls, hundreds of them, the great families of the realm, and I felt their eyes come to rest on me the way weight comes to rest on a beam. King Alaric sat the throne, and my heart, which had held steady through the terrace and the cell and the long nights, dropped, because the king looked worse than I had ever seen him. He sat sunk into the throne, gray-faced, his hands trembling faintly where they gripped the arms, and there was in his eyes a fogged, faraway distance that I had seen before in old men whose bodies had begun the long business of leaving them. The last 5 days had aged him 5 years. And I understood, with a cold that went to the bone, why the trap might be about to fail. The old king who had sealed the directive in strength was not the man on the throne today. Today's king was a fading light, and a fading king is a king whose sealed truths may be lost with him, and the Queen Consort knew it. You could see that she knew it, in the confidence with which she took her low throne, in the small proprietary way she glanced at her husband as though he were already furniture. The Queen Consort ran the trial. Not in name it was conducted by the Lord Justiciar, an old crow named Pellinore who had eaten at Morwenna's table for years. But in truth every question, every witness, every turn of it went the way she willed, and she sat her throne and watched her machinery run. They called the witnesses to my crime, and there was no defending against them because they told only the truth. Yes, the sergeant had grounded his rifle. Yes, before the whole court. Yes, when the Queen Consort had ordered him 3 times to present arms, he had refused. Yes, he had said, "I cannot," and offered no reason. Lord Cassius testified, smooth and grave, that he had seen the whole thing, and that in his judgment it was a deliberate and premeditated insult, the act of a man who had decided in advance to shame the crown. Lady Verena testified that she had heard the sergeant's tone, and that it was cold and defiant, without a trace of the confusion an honest error would show. Every word of it was accurate. That was the horror of it. They did not need to lie about me. The truth, stripped of the one thing that explained it, was damning all on its own. And then the justiciar turned to me and asked the question the whole hall had been leaning toward for 2 hours. "Sergeant Ashe, you have heard the testimony. You do not dispute the acts. This court gives you now the chance every accused is given to speak in your own defense. Explain your conduct. Give this court and your king one reason your refusal was not the treason it appears to be." He spread his thin hands. "Speak, man. Your life is in the balance. Only a fool would stay silent now. What have you to say?" The hall went quiet, hundreds of eyes, the king's fogged gaze somewhere near me. The Queen Consort leaning forward the smallest fraction on her low throne, and I understood that this was the moment she had built the whole apparatus to reach, because whatever I said now decided everything. If I stayed silent, I was convicted, and she used my conviction to crown herself. If I named the order, I warned her, and she went aground and won that way instead. She had built a trap with no exit. Speak and lose. Stay silent and lose. She had thought of everything. Everything, that is, but the one thing she could not have known. Because I looked up from the marble floor to answer the justiciar, to give, as I had planned, the same 2 words I had given on the terrace. "I cannot," and let them convict me and spring whatever was left of the trap, and my eye, traveling up the hall, caught on the great doors at the far end. They had opened, silently on their oiled hinges, a hand's width and then wide, and framed in them with the cold light of the forecourt behind him, stood Lord Hargrove, warden of the King's Guard, in his full uniform with the chain of his office across his chest, and behind him, at his shoulder, in the deep blue of the house, straight-backed for the first time in 5 days, stood the king, not the fading gray man on the throne. That king, I understood in a rush that turned the whole hall inside out, was not the king at all. "Hold," said Lord Hargrove, and his old cliff of a voice went down the great hall like a stone dropped into a well, and every head turned. "This court will hold. The king commands it." And the man on the throne, the gray, trembling, fading old man on the throne, went utterly still. I will tell you what I understood in the next several minutes, though I did not understand all of it at once. Some of it I pieced together afterward, from the warden's own mouth. But the shape of it broke over me as I stood there in my prisoner's coat, and it was the most complete reversal I have ever witnessed in a life full of turns. The king had not been on the throne for 5 days. The man who had walked the terrace at the founding, who had passed my file and given me that one grieving look, that had been the king truly that morning. But the king was old and failing, and he and Hargrove had known for some time that the Queen Consort was moving toward the endgame of a scheme years in the building, and they had known they would get one chance to draw it fully into the open, and they had known the king's failing health made him the weak point of any plan that relied on him. A dying king cannot be trusted to hold a role across days of pressure, so they had done a thing that was audacious to the point of madness, and it had worked. After the founding, the king had withdrawn publicly to his apartments, unwell from the exertion of the procession, which surprised no one, and in his place, on the throne, robed and crowned and playing the fading old man, had sat another, an old actor of the king's own trusted household, or a distant cousin of the blood. I never learned which, and it does not matter. What mattered was that the figure the Queen Consort had been watching for 5 days, the gray trembling king she had judged too weak to stop her, whose apparent decline had emboldened her to reach for the whole prize at once. That figure had been a mask. And behind the mask, unwatched, free to move, the true king had spent 5 days doing the one thing the Queen Consort's whole scheme depended on him being too weak to do. He had gathered the proof. Because my refusal on the terrace had done exactly what it was built to do. It had struck the Queen Consort's pride so publicly, so unbearably, that she could not let it lie. She had to answer it, had to build her monstrous treason trial, had to reach out in front of the whole court and take hold of the claim she had been hiding for years. That she and the crown were one, that an offense to her was treason to Eldermore, that she stood level with the king. She had reached for that power in the open, before the assembled houses, because a lone sergeant's insult had made her feel, for one terrible moment on the founder's terrace, that her hold on the realm was not yet absolute. And in reaching for it in the open, in convening this court, in packing it with her clients, in producing her witnesses and her bought justiciar, she had shown the king's own investigators exactly where every thread of her machinery ran. She had, in her rage, unrolled the whole map of her scheme in a single week, thinking she was crushing a sergeant, never dreaming the sergeant was the king's own hand laid deliberately upon the one nerve that would make her flinch. "This court," said the true king, and now his voice was not the fogged mumble of the throne but the clear cold voice of the man who had ruled Eldermore for 40 years, and had silenced the hall utterly, "was never lawful." He walked the length of the great hall as he spoke, Hargrove 1 pace behind, and behind Hargrove came a file of the king's guard, my own men, the second file, restored to arms, and behind them came Crown Prince Rowan, whose face as he looked at me was a thing I will not try to describe, because a man does not easily forgive himself for the 5 days he spent believing, even a little, that a true one might be false. "My wife," the king said, reaching the dais, looking down at the man in his own robes on his own throne, who rose now, unmasking, an old servant's face beneath the crown, and bowed low and stepped aside. "My wife has spent 5 days believing me too near my grave to see what she was doing. She judged from the state of a man she thought was me that her hour had come. She convened a court to try a soldier for treason, when the soldier's only crime was to obey an order sealed by my own hand, an order I gave, knowing it would ruin him in the eyes of the realm, knowing he would take the ruin in silence and never once betray me, because in 22 years of watching my guard I had learned that Corwin Ashe was the one man in my household who could be trusted with a wound and a silence both." The king turned from the throne and looked at me across the length of the hall, and the whole court turned with him, and for the second time in my life the king of Eldermore's eyes found mine, but not grieving now. Now there was something in them I had never thought to be given by a king. "Sergeant Ashe," he said, "you have been called a traitor before your realm for 5 days, and you did not break. You were offered your life for a single name twice, and you did not take it. You let your own brother believe he might be burying you, rather than spend a silence that was not yours to spend. I laid the heaviest burden I have ever laid on any man across your shoulders, and I could not tell you why, and I could give you no defender and no proof and no comfort, nothing but my word, sealed where you could not even see it. And you carried it. His voice did not shake, but something behind it did. I have commanded soldiers my whole life. I have never commanded a better one. And then the king of Eldermore, in front of the assembled noble houses of the realm, inclined his head to a common sergeant, standing in a prisoner's coat on the blackened white marble. The hall made a sound then, that same old sound the crowd had made when he came out of the great doors at the founding, the sound a people makes when it recognizes the thing it has agreed to honor. And I stood in the center of it in a coat with no rank on it, and I could not have spoken then to save my soul, because the whole of the 5 days came up in my throat at once, and a guard does not weep before the court. So I did the only thing left to me, which was to come to attention and hold, hard, eyes forward, and let the honor land on a man who could not answer it. The Queen Consort had risen from her low throne. She stood very straight, her face gone the color of ash beneath its paint, and I watched her do the arithmetic that I had done in the cell, watched her understand in a matter of seconds that the fading king had been a mask, that her 5 days of confidence had been walked into like a room with the floor removed, that everything she had built this week had been built on ground the king himself had shaped for her to build on. And I will grant her this. She did not scream, and she did not run. She had come to the palace with nothing but her wits and her nerve, and even at the end she reached for them. "My lord husband," she said, and her voice was almost steady, "I am glad beyond words to see you well. I have been sick with worry these 5 days. If there has been some misunderstanding about this court, it is only that in your absence I sought to defend the dignity of your crown against a soldier's insult. Surely a wife may." "Bring the case," the king said. He did not raise his voice. He said it to Hargrove, and Hargrove turned to the file behind him, and Lieutenant Devereux came forward carrying a long iron-bound box and set it on a table before the dais, and opened it, and began to lay its contents out where the whole court could see. And one by one, in the cold light of the great hall, the Queen Consort's 5 patient years came out of the box and lay exposed on the table. I will not detail all of it. A man's testimony should be plain, and I am no lawyer. But the shape of what the king had gathered in his 5 unwatched days was this. There were letters, in Lord Cassius's hand and in the Queen Consort's cipher, between her household and certain physicians, and certain servants of the nursery, and certain lords whose names made the hall gasp as the justiciar. No longer Morwenna's crow now, but a man reading very carefully for his own neck, read them aloud. There were drafts of a document, unsigned, that purported to alter the order of succession, moving Lord Cassius up and the king's own grandchildren down, requiring only the king's seal to become law, a seal she had meant, the letters made plain, to obtain by a means the king's physicians had already testified to in a sealed deposition. A slow preparation, added by degrees to an old and failing man's medicine, that would leave him pliant, confused, easily guided to sign what was put before him, and then leave him dead of natural decline once the signing was done. That was what the design had been built to stop. That was the child of the house Hargrove had spoken of on the postern watch. Not one child, but all 3 of them, Torin and Malin and little Bram, the whole line of Isolde's blood, to be set below Lord Cassius by a forged succession and a poisoned king. And the reason the king had staged his own decline, and sat a masked man on his throne, and laid an impossible order across a sergeant's shoulders, was that he had needed the Queen Consort to believe he was already failing, to believe her preparation was working, that her hour had come, so that she would move all her pieces into the open at once, reaching for the whole prize, and be caught with her hand closed around it in front of the entire realm. My refusal on the terrace had been the spark that made her overreach. My trial had been the stage she built to crown herself, all unknowing, above the very box that would damn her. "You gave me too much credit and not enough," the king said to his wife quietly in the ringing silence. "You believed a fading old man could not see you, but I have buried one wife I loved, Morwenna, and I know the difference between a decline that God sends and one that a woman brews in a cup. I have watched you 6 years. I let you think I was blind because a blind king is the only kind you would move against in the open. And you moved." He looked at the box. "There is enough here to answer for what you meant to do to my grandchildren. There is enough here to answer for what you meant to do to me." Lord Cassius bolted for the doors. He got perhaps 10 paces before the second file closed on him, my own men, and there was nothing soft about it. They took him down onto the marble and held him there, and it was the only violence in the whole of that hall, brief and controlled and proportionate. A scheming man's scramble ended by disciplined hands, and I confess I felt no sorrow watching it. "Take them both," the king said. "The warden's charge. Held for the crown's justice." And the king's guard came forward, and the Queen Consort Morwenna, who had walked the founder's terrace 5 days before in cloth of gold, expecting the stone itself to bow to her, was escorted from the great hall of Eldermore under guard, and the noble houses she had spent 6 years buying stood along the walls and did not lift a finger to help her, because that is the way of bought men when the payment stops. At the doors she stopped and turned and found me in the crowd, a common sergeant in a prisoner's coat, and she looked at me for a long moment, and I could not read all of what was in that look, but part of it, I think, was the thing she had said to me in the cell and had meant, and now understood the full price of. In a different life I could have used a man who lies that well, except I had not lied to her once. I had told her the plain truth every time, that I refused because I could not do otherwise, and she had been so certain there must be a name behind it that she had never once believed the simplest thing in front of her. That a man might do a hard, ruinous, honorable thing for no reason, but that his king had asked it, and his own faith allowed it. Then they took her out, and the great doors closed, and it was over. It was not, of course, over. Things like that are never over the way a story ends. They have a long, slow tale of consequence that the great hall never sees. There were weeks of the crown's justice, and the succession made secure by the king's own signed and witnessed hand, Rowan confirmed heir, and his children after him, all 3 of them, entered plainly into the roll so that no forged paper could ever move them again. There were the bought lords to be sorted, some pardoned, some ruined, each according to how far his selling had gone. The Queen Consort and her son answered to the crown's justice for what they had meant to do, and were set where they could do no more of it, and I will say no more of them, because a man of my station should not gossip about the fall of the great, even the great who deserved it. But there is a smaller ending mine, and it is the one I keep. The king released me from my silence in the great hall itself, the same hour before the whole court, and my rank was restored and more, but I asked for the more to be set aside, and the king, understanding me, allowed it. I did not want a captaincy bought with those 5 days. I did not want to be the sergeant who refused the queen and rose from it. I wanted my file back. The second file of the Ravenmore line, the most honored post on the long terrace. That was all. And the king, who understood the honor of small things better than most kings do, gave it to me, and clasped my hand, the king's own hand, that had been sealed away where I could not see it, closing warm and dry around mine at last, and said, low, so that only I could hear, "You stood my door too, sergeant, these 5 days. Isolde chose her true ones well, and so I find have I, and I did not trust my voice to answer, so I bowed, and he let me go. My brother Aldous was at the gates when they let me out, with his 2 boys, who had run all the way up from the lower town, when the news reached the market that their uncle was no traitor, but the man who had saved the king's own grandchildren. The younger one, the one who had come home from the yard asking if it was true, threw his arms around my waist and would not let go, and Aldous stood over us with his big smith's arms folded and his eyes wet again, and said only gruff, "Told the boys. Told them you kept your king's faith. Turns out I undersold it." And we walked down into the lower town together, and there was ale, and there was too much of it. And for one night I was not a symbol of discipline, but only a man among his own, which a guard is allowed to be, once in a great while, when the storm has passed. And the children of the house did not forget. A week after, standing my post again in the forecourt in the ordinary quiet of an ordinary morning, I felt someone watching me, and I moved only my eyes. A guard does not turn his head. And there, at the edge of the colonnade, stood little Prince Bram, 6 years old, holding his sister Malin's hand, both of them looking up at me the way you look at something out of a story. Malin, who missed nothing, who was 9 and understood more of what had happened than her brother did, gave me a small grave nod, the nod of a princess to a man who had stood between her family and the dark, and it was worth more than any rank the king could have pinned on me. And little Bram let go of his sister's hand and squared his small shoulders and lifted his own hand to his brow solemnly and gave me the salute, the same salute he had given me on the terrace a lifetime ago, the salute that had hung in the air while I decided whether to save him or be damned for nothing. And this time because I was on ordinary duty, and the protocol allows a guard his humanity when no ceremony is in train, and because there are debts a man pays with his whole heart or not at all. This time I brought my white glove up to my own brow, and I returned it. To a small prince in an empty forecourt, with no court to see and no crowd to cheer, and no king to honor me for it. Just a soldier and a child and a salute given clean, the way it was always meant to be given. Not to power, not to gold, not to a woman in cloth of gold who demanded the stone itself bow down, but freely, to someone worth the honoring. That is the whole of it. People still tell the story wrong. In the town, the sergeant who broke royal protocol, who refused the Queen Consort her salute on the founder's terrace and shamed the crown before 10,000 people. They tell it as a scandal or a wonder, and they always ask the same thing. How could a man of 22 years' faultless service do such a thing? And I never correct them because the true answer is the whole of my trade, and it does not fit in the market's mouth. I did not break protocol. I kept it the deepest protocol there is, the one beneath the salute, the one the salute is only the sign of. A guard does not give his honor to whoever demands it loudest. He holds it in trust for the crown, and he gives it where the crown truly lives, and on that terrace for those 5 days, the crown did not live in a woman's raised chin or a bought court's votes. It lived in a sealed order, in an old king's faith, in 3 small children asleep behind a nursery door, and in one man's willingness to be called a traitor by the whole world rather than betray the truth of it by a single lifted hand. I withheld one salute, once in front of the realm. I have never given the salute more truly than in the withholding of it. And when they took my rifle and my gloves and marched me the length of my disgrace past 240 silent men, I held my head up, and I would do the whole of it again tomorrow. The cell and the trial and my brother's tears and all, for the sight of a small prince, safe, saluting a soldier in an empty forecourt on an ordinary morning, because the crown had held and the dark had not come, and the man who could not move had, in the one moment it mattered, not moved. That is what we are for, that is the whole of it, and it is enough.